This is It's a Mystery Podcast. Let us tell you a story. Hello, mystery readers. Welcome to episode 79 of It's a Mystery Podcast. I'm your host, mystery author Alexandra Amor, and today I have an interview for you with Michael Pronko. He's also going to read from his first book in his Tokyo mystery series called The Moving Blade. And it was so interesting to talk to Michael about his books and his characters and living in Japan. He's lived there for a long time. And as you'll hear in the interview, we touch on a couple of things. He not only writes mystery novels, but he writes essays and memoir about Japan. He has a website about jazz. He loves music. So we touch on that as well. And I've put links to these things in the show notes as ever. And you can always find those at itsamysterypodcast.com, and then just click on the episode that you're interested in. In this case, it would be episode 79. So that's really all I have to say today, other than I hope you're doing well and staying healthy at this really, really challenging time in the world. It's March 27th, 2020, as I record this, and we're all going through something we've never experienced before. And one thing I'm really appreciating and I'm really grateful for is this podcast for a few reasons. One, because I get to connect with amazing authors all over the world. And two, because I get to share those authors and their books with you. And I think at this time, I know I'm reading a little bit more, and I suspect many of you are as well. So I hope that the show is a great resource for you to find new books to read. That's certainly the intention. And I really appreciate being able to do this every week. And I love that even though I'm kind of practicing social distancing and not going out very much except for maybe a walk every day, I can still produce the show. So that's one advantage of the technology that we enjoy these days. And then the only other thing I wanted to touch on as well is just to remind all of us, including myself, of how resilient and resourceful and adaptable human beings are. Elizabeth Gilbert touched on that today in an Instagram post, and I just want to echo what she has to say. I've been thinking about this for several days, and she points out that as human beings, we really hate change, and we really do. Even the tiniest things change in our lives, and we tend to freak out. And yet, we're so adaptable, when things do change and when big things change, like what's happening right now, we're so adaptable. I've just watched in awe with all the things going on around the world, the ways that we're changing and adapting so quickly to what's happening. People in my tiny town where I live, for example, are now standing 2 meters away from each other when we're in line at the grocery store. I see people, and I do it myself, when we bump into each other on the street, into people that we know, we stand several meters apart. It's just remarkable. I could go on and on listing all the things that are happening, and I'm sure those things are happening where you are. So anyway, I just wanted to remind all of us of how resilient human beings are, how resourceful, how adaptable. And we do, I think we are taking all the right measures. We had some positive news here in British Columbia today. It looks like it's kind of an early assessment of what's going on, but it's looking like we are flattening the curve by taking the measures that we've taken in this province. Things like closing restaurants, closing down public events, closing movie theaters, all that kind of thing. So, after several very challenging weeks, that was a pinprick of light in the darkness, which I really appreciated. So I hope that the It's a Mystery Podcast episodes are a bit of light in your day as well. And please enjoy this interview with Michael Pronko, and I will talk to you next week. Take care and wash your hands. Bye. Michael Pronko is an award-winning, Tokyo-based author of the Detective Hiroshi mystery series. His first mystery, The Last Train, was selected as the winner of the Shelf Unbound contest for Best Independently Published Book of 2018, and his second novel, The Moving Blade, won the Independent Press Award for Crime Fiction and was named by Kirkus Reviews as one of the best indie mysteries and thrillers of 2018. He also writes about jazz for his own website, Jazz in Japan, and teaches American literature and culture at Michael, I'm going to screw it up anyway. Meiji Gakuin University. Thank you. Well, welcome to the show, Michael.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is great, and it's a big pleasure to be here.
Oh, I'm thrilled. So you're going to read to us today from a chapter from The Moving Blade, which is the second book in the Tokyo Mysteries.
That's right.
All right.
The very beginning part. So.
All right. Take it away.
Okay. Thanks. The Moving Blade, Chapter 1. Hideous Sato rarely took jobs involving foreigners. They usually lived in tall apartment buildings, kept little cash, and had bad taste in valuables. But this job was pitched as an easy in and out with good pay and a light load. Getting into the house was, as always in Tokyo, a cinch. He slid a small tension wrench into the keyhole of the kitchen delivery door, levered it up, poked in a rake pick, and after a few tickles, the lock plug spun loose, and he was in. The homeowner had just died, so Sato timed the break-in during the funeral, the best time to rob anyone in Tokyo. After the long ceremony, cremation took an hour or so, depending. Since the owner was famous, Bernard Mattson was a name even Sato knew. The post-funeral chit-chat by bigwigs would give him a further cushion. Sato left his shoes by the door and stepped into the stately old house in the Asakusa Shitamachi, lower town district of eastern Tokyo. The kitchen had surprisingly few modern appliances and looked a little like he remembered his grandmother's in the countryside. Spacious, simple, functional. Walking into the living area, Sato admired the exquisite wood beams and intricate wood paneling. A tatami-floored room in Japanese style, empty, save for a scroll, statue, and vase, open to the right. The main living room was Western style, with parquet floors that were wide and open, with a sofa, chairs, tree trunk table, and Japanese antiques. Sato found the bookcase-lined study and sat down at the computer to copy the two files he'd been hired to retrieve, Sofa and Shunga. It would be easy to download the files to 2 USB drives and erase the computer before carrying the drives across town. But the computer was old and slow, the fan whirling loudly as he downloaded the files. All around him, the wood frame house creaked like an old man's bones. When he downloaded one file on each of the 2 separate USB drives, he pulled out a DVD to wipe the computer clean. He rebooted and waited while it worked its magic. He turned off the computer, waited, turned it back on. A small arrow pulsed at the bottom of the empty green screen. Pressing the keys and clicking the mouse had no effect. It was wiped clean. As he rose, Sato could not help but look around, impressed at the offset shelves, Polonia Tansu chests, and bamboo sleeve pothook dangling from the ceiling. His grandmother had cooked with one of those. Many things in the room could be resold, but from the long shelves along the wall, he pocketed 4 easy-to-carry Netsuke carvings, a smiling frog, a tanuki raccoon dog, and 2 of couples locked in sexual embrace. The Netsuke were like ivory diamonds, compact and easy to sell. On the way out, Sato surveyed the kitchen. It was hard to guess where a foreigner would tuck away cash, if at all, but he went with instincts honed by years of breaking in Japanese homes. Inside an old tea cabinet, he found a cherry bark box with a false bottom, concealing a thick wad of 10,000 yen notes. Not so different. Sato chuckled to himself as he stuffed the money in his pocket next to the Netscape and USB drives. He slipped on his shoes, closed the door, exited through the garden, and walked away as if he had lived in the neighborhood all his life. It wasn't until he was changing trains in Ueno that he noticed the foreigner. Over the years, Sato had been tackled, punched, stabbed, and slapped so his eardrum burst, but by following his most basic rule of never stopping, he always got away. He could run like a young man no longer, so he doubled up on caution. Now he had something new, a gaijin trailing him through Tokyo. He'd noticed him on the train, but many foreigners returned from Asakusa on the same route. This foreigner, though, wasn't checking his cell phone for directions or looking at his camera photos. He was staring out the window at the subway walls, too patiently, too attentive to nothing. Sato got off in Ueno and glanced back to see the foreigner riding the escalator a dozen steps behind. He was so tall he had to duck under the metal ceiling panels. His hat hid his face, and a black leather coat stretched to his calves. Sato hurried to the Yamanote Line platform without looking back. When the train got to Tokyo Station, Sato could see his head jutting over the crowd like a giraffe. All that milk and beef, Sato thought. It was trying to get milk and beef that pushed him into housebreaking 50 years ago. So Sato decided to follow another of his rules: stay on the train. The rush hour crowds in the stations made it easy to lose anyone. Best plan was to ride all the way to Shinbashi, hurry up and over and down to the next platform for a train back toward Tokyo Station, and then push into the middle of the jam-packed car just before the doors closed. At Tokyo Station, he glanced back down the long, steep escalator of the Chuo line. The foreigner was gone. As he rode up, Sato texted the address of the house in Asakusa to the crew waiting to get in, describing what was there and estimating how long they had to get in and out. He was glad to leave the heavy stuff to the Koreans and Chinese. They were younger, quicker, and stronger. Braver, too, he had to admit. He was never sure where they hawked what they carted off, but that wasn't any of his concern. He trusted them for his cut, which was always sent promptly through automatic bank transfer. At Shinjuku Station, Sato followed another of his rules and steered himself to the densest middle of the crowd. Outside the station, he blended in with the pedestrians hunkered deep into their coats against the winter wind, moving at their pace. A bit more caution wouldn't hurt, he decided, so he turned into the Isetan department store. The first floor was crowded for a perfume sale with neatly dressed Japanese women sampling scents. Sato slipped through the medley of aromas and down a stairway to the tight-set basement counters selling tea, jam, cheese, pickles, miso, and dried fish, a maze no foreigner could manage. Sato zigzagged past middle-aged women sniffing out daily bargains as salespeople called out their wares in booming, froggy voices. At the back of the basement floor, the underground market ended at a door into a bland corridor with stairs up to Yasukuni Dori Street. He finally stopped in the fresh air outside and lit a cigarette by a display window of fall fashions. He looked back and forth from the mannequins in their put-on poses to the glass doors he just exited. He smoked all the way down to the filter. Maybe he was being too cautious, but that was better. People flowed around him on the sidewalk, so he huddled close to the big window to wiggle one of the USB drives into the cigarette pack for safekeeping. He decided to smoke one more. When he finished, no one had emerged. Lost him, his instincts told him, as he ground out the butt. Smug, he still had the knack. Halfway downhill towards Golden Guy, he stopped to buy cigarettes at a small tobacco stand wedged into a 4-floor building. He slid a 1,000-yen bill under the glass counter and looked back the way he came. As the old woman gave him change, he caught her rheumy eyes set deep in her furrowed smoker's face and quickly looked away. She was old, and her cheeks hung from her head like worn saddlebags. Sato stood there and tamped the fresh pack, then pulled out a few of the cigarettes, slipped the other USB drive in, and tossed out the couple cigarettes that wouldn't fit in to the gutter. He walked on to a narrow intersection a few blocks down and turned onto a small street cramped with beer crates, styrofoam fish boxes, and plastic trash cans. Some of the spotlights from the tall nightclubs on the main street had clicked on, but it would stay dark and deserted in the arm's-width alleys of Golden Guy until customers started arriving much later. Sato turned into a narrow dead end with a patchwork of bars, not much wider than their doors, and stopped in front of the Pan Pan Club. It was far ahead of the rendezvous time, and Sato recited another of his rules: never rush things. But this time he broke it. It would be better to get rid of whatever was on the USB drives and go have a drink and a good meal with the cash he'd lifted. Sato knocked on the door, the only one not slathered in thick paint or handwritten signs. He got no answer. Before he could knock again, he sensed someone behind him. He fumbled for the handle of the stiletto inside his jacket and plucked the metal baton from his waistband, turning around with both hands ready. "Hand me the files," the foreigner commanded in fluent Japanese. His tall, lean frame blocked the trickle of light from the alley beyond. A single overhead bulb cast their shadows in opposite directions. Sato was surprised by how well he spoke Japanese, by how he knew about the files, by how he had, in fact, tracked him across the city and managed to confront him right at that spot. How could this have happened? He'd never been cornered before. "It's just easier if you hand them over," the foreigner said. He held out his left hand and reset his feet and shoulders. His leather coat gleamed in the dim light. Sato reached into his jacket for the drive-wiping DVD and tossed it onto the pavement between them. When he bent over to get it, he'd kick the foreigner in the head, stab him, and take off. The sides of the small bars were only a step away, so he'd have to be careful getting past. 15 years ago, he could have done it. 30 years ago, it would have been as easy as picking a lock. The DVD shimmered on the dull gray of the concrete, but the foreigner did not even glance at it. From a sheath inside the front flap of his coat, the foreigner pulled a tonto sword as long as his forearm. Together, sword and arm could reach the walls of the cramped cul-de-sac encircling them. Sato clicked the stiletto and telescoped the baton with a flip of his wrist. The sword whirred and Sato jerked sideways as the sword crashed into the door above his shoulder, splintering the cheap wood. The sword pinched in place. Sato jabbed at the foreigner's chest, but his arms were too short, and the foreigner was fast and limber. Blade and baton whisked the air. Sato backed against the closest wall to rebalance, breathing hard, trying to think. "The USB." The sword upright and his feet planted, the foreigner stared at Sato. Sato's stiletto had no reach and the baton was too thin, but he swung them side to side in a defensive X as he broke for the opening to the alley. The tonto sword caught him from right hip to left rib. Sato's knees buckled and he folded over like a split sack of rice. In the instant before his midsection gushed from top and bottom, One of the USB drives flew out of his cut-open pocket and dropped through the grate of the sewer beside him. The foreigner snatched at it, but the memory drive tumbled into the pipes far out of reach below. Slumped over a concrete step, Sato wheezed and clutched at the warm stream of blood before his fingers loosened and his body slackened. He eyed the foreigner kneeling over the sewer with a small flashlight peering below, felt the ruffle of the foreigner going through his pockets, and dimly gazed at the tangled wires crisscrossing the alley overhead.
Awesome job. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I'll let you take a sip of water there. So tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this series of mysteries. I noticed on your website that you talk about writing mystery, memoir, and music. Yes. Yeah. So where did the mysteries come from?
Well, I had written a lot about Tokyo over the years. So I used to write for Newsweek Japan, and those were kind of the foreigner's perspective on Tokyo. What do you think? How do you see it? And I loved writing those, but, there were 700 or 800 word columns. And I just, the longer I live here, the more stories are there. So, taking Tokyo and putting it into essay format was great, and I still do that. But I just wanted to tell a kind of longer story, a longer reaction about Tokyo. And the city has there's so many people, and it's a complicated place. So the mysteries just seemed a very fitting form to respond to the city and tell something more about it from my point of view.
Oh, I love that. Okay. And then, so tell us a bit about Detective Hiroshi. Who is he?
Well, he's kind of Japanese, but not Japanese. He spent a lot of time overseas in America, and he's fluent in English. He's an accountant, actually, but because of the homicides in Tokyo have become increasingly international, right, with different people from different countries and crime leaping the borders. So the homicide department needed to have somebody who could both track the money and speak English. And so he has his Japanese side because he grew up here, but he also has a kind of foreign point of view as well. And so he's kind of in Japan, but not totally of Japan, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. And does he work for the police department there then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but he's not like a detective like old school detectives that he also works with. Right. So there's Sakaguchi and Takamatsu. Sakaguchi is an ex-sumo wrestler turned policeman and then detective. And then Takamatsu is kind of the, really old school, whatever it takes to get results detective, right? So the three of them each have their own approach to the cases. But we see things through Hiroshi's point of view.
And I thought it was really cool that one of the characters was an ex-sumo wrestler. It just occurred to me that that's not, well, how would I put this? That, you think of sumo wrestlers as doing that job, but not being anything else. So is he based on someone or was that something you just came up with?
Well, yeah, I think there's been a lot of sumo wrestlers over the years, and I love sumo, so I was not a fanatic about it, but I really enjoyed it over the years. And, usually you do think of sumo wrestlers as a wrestler, not a person.
Yes, yeah.
And, originally they were kind of gods, right? There's sacred space inside the ring, and women are not allowed to go into that sacred space traditionally. And, so there's a lot of religious or spiritual elements to that as well. But I thought, having him moved to doing something, well, moral, I guess, an ethical, policeman and detective is an ethical job, was really interesting, so that he had the strength and power, which sumo wrestlers have to develop, lack of fear. But at the same time, he had this kind of moral quality to him. So, he's kind of a quiet type. So he's not like, a bubbling conversationalist. He is in some ways what you think of a sumo wrestler, which is just, kind of answering, That's right. So he's a little bit that way, but something more as well.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. And then the next question I had for you, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it. I feel like in the Western English speaking world, there's a certain culture of mysteries. So yes. We might talk about the sort of, closed room, starting in England, yes. And the cozy mysteries, and then in North America, the kind of the thrillers, which are similar probably to what you're writing. Do you think does Japan have its own murder mystery culture in that way, in fiction?
Yes, I think it does. Coming, the entire kind of literary tradition from China and Korea and Japan, they did have mysteries, right? And there were characters that were judges, essentially, right? Judges in the government that decided cases. And so they had their own way of kind of finding out what happened, right? But then kind of in the when Japan was kind of becoming more cosmopolitan after the Meiji reform, so early part of 20th century, then it was wildly popular. I think just the same as in the West, there would be murder mysteries in the newspaper. There would be cases, people would line up to go to the trials, and then putting, different writers into a more Western style format. That was really kind of, in the 1930s that happened, but after World War II was when that really took off. So yes, there is a tradition of that. And certainly now some of the Japanese mystery writers and thriller writers are just, they're really phenomenal. But I think some of those writers tend to write Japanese thrillers, Japanese mysteries for Japanese. And of course, it's interesting from the outside, but I think in some of my mysteries, I try to, know who's reading it from both sides, right? So I've written for a Japanese audience, but I've written about Japan for a Western audience. So that might be just a little bit different from the Japanese writers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I imagine it's interesting for you as someone born in the United States and now having lived in Japan for a long time to be straddling those cultural lines. And I think it's cool that your detective is Japanese. He's not an American citizen, living there.
Yeah, well, I wanted to do that, and actually, he's probably based mostly on my students. Actually, a lot of my students had spent lots of time overseas, right? So, for example, their father was posted in Hong Kong or in New York or something, right? So those students, or maybe one of their parents is from America or Britain or something, and so those students kind of tend to gravitate towards my classes a little bit because they're not, quote unquote, pure Japanese, because, they speak English well, they understand the Western point of view. So Hiroshi is Japanese, but he also has that kind of outside perspective. And some of my students who had spent time abroad, years abroad, they often kind of see things more like me than like Japanese would, right?
Yeah.
I could kind of, get inside Hiroshi's point of view a little bit better, I think.
Yes, yeah. Hiroshi is almost the sort of the flip side to you.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, very cool. Interesting. In The Moving Blade, one of the plot points pivots on a diplomat who, correct, who has died or had been murdered.
Yeah.
And you explore the American bases that are over in Japan.
Yeah.
Do you want to just touch on that a little bit and tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, the American bases are just, part of Japan now, and they have been, since World War II. One of the things about the bases that is a little bit unusual, I guess, in the world is that everything inside it is basically secret, right? I mean, there's no reporting on that. There's no going inside and looking around. I mean, there's days when that's open and you can go inside and that, 4th of July, things like that. And a couple of my students have worked on the bases, in the shops and things like that. So it's not closed. But basically, these are, military spaces, and they are run under American military rule. So, as you might expect, there's, ambivalence about the American presence there in places like Okinawa, where, large amount of land is given to the American bases. People really don't accept that and want to find some other solution for having those bases there. But on the other hand, older generation of Japanese really appreciates the American presence. And, they see the American bases as a kind of protection from China and North Korea and things like that. So it's a very, very complicated issue. And I kind of wanted to it didn't go into that per se, but that's an important part of Japanese society, having bases there. And it has a tremendous effect on the culture and government and politics and everything. So,
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, interesting. Well, then, one final question for you. So there are 2 Tokyo mysteries out currently: The Last Train, and The Missing Blade, which you read from today. And then there's a third one coming out called Tokyo Traffic.
Yes.
And we're recording this in March of 2020, and I think that book will be out soon. Is that right?
Yes. It's, I don't know why this one has taken a little bit longer than the others, but it's almost done. So it's also the same set of detectives, and they're investigating human trafficking through Japan and use of cryptocurrencies by various different kinds of people, but certainly people are using that for illegal transactions. So Hiroshi is trying to look at the government and the human traffickers and piece that together and find out, what happened at the beginning of the plot, which is several murders. So that's going to be out, I hope, by the end of April, should be. And end of April in Japan, April is kind of the restart of the year. So there's cherry blossoms and school starts. Although with the coronavirus, it may not start up this year. We're still kind of waiting to hear. But I thought having it come out in April would be a good time to release it. So, yeah.
Great. And then do you have plans for more Detective Hiroshi books, do you think?
Yes, I do. I have a couple outlined already, so I'll keep going with that series. I may do a standalone that focuses on Sakaguchi, who's the sumo wrestler, and then the other character, or the other detective, Takamatsu, is kind of a little bit older, so I'll do maybe a prequel about him, because he's his own kind of, let's just get this done however we can kind of person. And he's a kind of intriguing character himself. So we'll see which one of those I leap onto next. But I think I'll do one more Hiroshi before I look at the other standalones. So, yeah, so more's coming.
Great. Oh, well, that's good to know. Well, thank you, Michael. This has been fantastic. So why don't you let our listeners know where they can find out more about you and your books?
Yes. You can find out more about me on my website, which is www.michaelpronko.com. And you can find out pretty much everything there, latest news. There's a newsletter. Please sign up if you're interested. I write a little bit about Tokyo and what's happening and seasonal things, and a little bit essay-like and news of new releases. Let's see, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, Instagram. My students have forced me to get onto Instagram. I can't use it. I have to, text them. How do I? Something. So they're teaching me slowly. And then, let's see, where else? Yeah, Facebook, Twitter. Oh, also, please check out my jazz site.
Right.
jazzinjapan.com. That's information about the jazz scene here. And I'll have a guidebook about jazz coming out sometime after the novel comes out. It's almost done, but I don't know. I never did a guidebook before, so we'll see how it comes out. But I wanted to get that out before the Olympics in the summer. So yeah, I'm a real jazz fan. So check that out as well.
Oh, very cool. All right. And I'll put links to everything you've mentioned in the show notes as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me today. It's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. I had to ask the construction guys next door to be quiet for about an hour. So I need to run over and tell them it's okay to restart the construction and be noisy. So, but that's been a real pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's a great site. So.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thank you for listening. You can always find episode show notes and links to the books mentioned on the show at itsamysterypodcast.com. While you're there, you can also grab your copies of 2 free mystery novellas by me, Alexandra Amor. Until next time, happy reading!